If you were with us last week, you may remember that I took issue with the gospel writer's interpretation of Jesus' parable. Luke presented it as a parable about prayer, whereas I see it as a parable about social activism. This week, though, I tend to agree with the writer who introduces the parable with the words, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. But the temptation is to turn it into a parable about prayer. The wrong way to pray, we reason, is to pray the way the Pharisee prayed. His prayer appeared to be a self-centered prayer dressed up as a prayer of gratitude. The Pharisee looks down his nose at most other people, including the tax collector, and uses his time with God to brag about his good deeds. And so we label him to be a hypocrite. One hesitates to even call it a prayer. The King James Version seems to think so too. The Pharisee, it says, stood and prayed thus with himself. It sounds as if he's praying not to God, but to himself, merely singing his own praises, and maybe he was. Fortunately, we aren't like the Pharisee, we say to ourselves. We don't use our prayer time to talk badly about others or to brag about our religious conduct. Our prayers are more like the tax collectors, we say. We know we are sinners and we ask God for forgiveness. That's how a real Christian ought to pray, we declare. But I think we run into dangerous territory if we try to turn this parable into one that instructs us on how to pray. I don't think it was offered up for that purpose, either by Jesus or the gospel writer. And besides, Jesus was very clear about how to pray when he instructed his disciples to pray for things like daily bread, forgiveness of sin, and deliverance from temptation. We run into equally dangerous territory when we make presumptions about a person's character based on how they pray. For instance, we are mistaken if we presume the tax collector to be a good guy after all because he humbly asked for mercy. The tax collector wasn't a good guy. Being a tax collector in first century Palestine wasn't like working for the IRS today. It was more like working for a title loan company whose exorbitant interest rates run people into deeper and deeper debt. There was nothing noble about being a tax collector. He was viewed as a collaborator with the enemy, a traitor to his people, and someone who made his living by cheating others out of their income. In his prayer, the tax collector asks for mercy. It might be that he was asking for forgiveness for having overcharged his neighbors. Or when he asked for mercy, he might have been asking God to help him to escape a system in which he was trapped, escape it and find a better, more upstanding job. He asked for mercy, but his prayer gives us no reason to believe that he did anything other than return to making his living by cheating other people out of their money. And we do a disservice to the Pharisee when we automatically imagine him to be a hypocrite because of his prayer. Although the New Testament usually casts Pharisees in that role, that wasn't always the case. Bible scholar Richard Swanson notes, the Pharisees preserved faith in God even under the crushing force of Roman military domination, and they preserved it by maintaining clarity about the way the goodness of God ought to shape all of faithful life. In short, Pharisees weren't the nasty bad guys that we often see them portrayed as in the Bible. They believed the law applied to everyone, not just the priests. And so for the Pharisee in this morning's parable to offer a prayer of gratitude that he was not like others is not much different than when we see someone who looks to be hungover standing on a street corner with a sign asking for money, and we breathe a word of gratitude there, but by the grace of God go I. And whereas the Torah required fasting 1 day a year, he fasts twice a week, which was not uncommon among the pious. And whereas the law dictated the tithing of agricultural products, he gives a tenth of all of his income. I'll be up front with you. There are days when I wouldn't mind having a Pharisee or two in our congregation. The Pharisee behaved righteously. He displayed morally good and upright behavior. The Pharisee went to the temple a righteous man, and he left the temple a righteous man. But the tax collector was not righteous. The fact that he was a tax collector implied that he cheated people. There's nothing morally good or upright about that sort of behavior. But here's the zinger of the parable. Jesus declares that the tax collector went home justified. According to the online Oxford Dictionary, the word justified, as it's used here, means declared or made righteous in the sight of God. Merriam-Webster says, treated as righteous and worthy of salvation. The Pharisee was righteous because of his own deeds, but because God is a God of grace and mercy, the tax collector was made righteous in the sight of God despite his deeds and declared as worthy of salvation as the Pharisee. The tax collector asked for mercy, and God granted it, as God always does. Two people went to the temple. One was righteous by his own deeds, and the other who was not. Those same two people left the temple that day, both of them righteous, but only one of them justified. And that, my friends, is an amazing statement about the character of God. It's good news for you and me because it's a parable about grace. God's grace. Grace that extends to everyone, including the thieves, rogues, and adulterers of the Pharisees' prayer. Grace that extends to the hypocrites and the holy, to the poor and the prosperous, to the doubter and the devoted, to those with a regrettable past and those with a hopeful future. All of us are justified. We are made righteous and worthy of salvation because of the grace of God. Unearned grace that is freely given. Can it get any better than this? For those who imagine that there are insiders and outsiders in the realm of God, this parable puts an end to that sort of nonsense. And for anyone who thinks that their own good deeds make them better in the sight of God than other people, again, this parable says differently. It says that God is compassionate enough to answer prayers like the one in this morning's parable. That's the God I want to share with you this morning. Not a God who keeps a tally of who's been naughty and who's been nice. Not a God with a list of requirements who smacks us upside the head for stepping out of line, but a God of grace and compassion, a God of love and forgiveness, a God who is for us and not against us. That's the God whom Jesus worshiped. A God whom the church at times seems to have lost sight of. But thankfully, there is hope for those who have been made to feel low, hope for the humble. For they are the very ones who are exalted according to our text, lifted up in the eyes of God. God's grace is for everyone, no exceptions. May we believe it with our minds, may we feel it with our hearts, and may we live it out in our daily lives. Amen.